Okay, so let's talk about structural factors, sort of the big picture factors that might have underpinned why people in the Arab world wanted to engage in forms of popular protest against authoritarian regimes. Well, the first is that these regimes were incredibly politically corrupt. Not only was there no opportunity for people, or limited opportunities for people to really engage in forms of free political participation, they also engaged in forms of economic corruption that had real costs for the population. We also know that in order to maintain political order, a number of these regimes engaged in forms of torture and repression that were very negatively received by the populations. This Arab authoritarianism was combined with economic crisis. Now, this isn't the kind of acute economic crisis that might take place just in a single year, but instead a number of years of economic stagnation, unemployment, and a retrenching of the state that led to increasing discontent from the economic perspective. So one demographic factor associated with that was the youth bulge that we've all heard about, that was very important and played a role in sort of creating the conditions that made these uprisings possible. And the other was, if you think about the Middle East and the Arab world compared to other parts of the world, the region just has not been growing at the same rate as countries in East Asia and Latin America. And so this created a kind of sense in the Middle East that they were somehow being left behind by all of the growth in technology and investment that was happening in other parts of the world. The jobs just weren't being created in the Middle East to the same extent. The third sort of structural factor is what I'm calling a failure of the social contract. So for those of you guys who have studied Middle Eastern history, you'll know that in the 1950s, there was a big movement of Arab socialism. States were providing real benefits to citizens that included things like free quality public education, guarantees of public employment. These sorts of factors were becoming really watered down, lower quality, and less relevant for the relationship between citizens and the state. So there sort of developed this crisis of political representation. People did not feel as though the things they wanted out of government were being met. And there was an associated rise in political protest activity. So the 2011 uprisings were viewed in the West, but these weren't the only protests that were happening in the region. There had been labor protests for years. There had been student protests that had been building in scope and magnitude. So let's talk about each of these factors just briefly. If you look at a map of political freedom produced by Freedom House in 2010, the year before the uprisings, it's noticeable that the not free areas of the world, many of these countries tend to be in the Arab world and the Middle East. Only Turkey and Morocco come up as partly free. And there's really no country in the Middle East, apart from Israel, that you might be considered a full democracy. And even Israel, some people might argue that the political system there doesn't approach democracy fully because of the treatment of the Palestinian minority. If we look at human rights violations and incidents of torture, again, we see the Middle East coming up as an area where many people have been subjected to forms of police brutality, torture within prison. Rates of death within prison tend to be very high. A lot of imprisonment for political crimes, not just other sorts of regular crimes that we might think of in the US as being the reason why you'd get imprisoned. If we look at the population of individuals younger than 30 years, where red, the darker red, represents more young people in the society. In 2005, again, we see the Middle East and Africa as being areas where we have extremely young populations. And finally, if we think about income per capita GDP, and we look at the Middle East compared to other parts of the world, only Saudi Arabia and Libya really kind of stand out as areas that are even sort of middle income countries. And we know that part of the reason why they're middle income is because they have tremendous oil wealth. So the rest of the region, the non-oil producing countries in the region tend to be quite poor, and people have very limited economic opportunities. So given these underlying political and economic grievances, why did protests take place when it did, right? These were factors that have been in place for many years. And there was no one who was saying in January 2011 that there was going to be an uprising now. All of these conditions had existed previously. Well, some people would argue that the economic pressure and the political corruption had been growing to kind of a breaking point. And one reason was that commodity prices had gone up in the years before, and that there was a crisis of food, just basic meeting of food needs. The price of wheat had gone up. In Egypt, the year before, the military had taken over production of bread. This is sort of considered a staple of the Egyptian diet, and it was important to make sure that that remained something that continued to be produced. Even if bakers no longer made a profit producing it, someone had to make that bread to feed the 80 million Egyptian people. And this continued decline of what you might consider sort of the Arab welfare state or the socialist state as a result of both neoliberal economic policies and also this sort of crisis of political legitimacy contributed to the feeling that these countries were really on the brink. Now, of course, it was Tunisia that was the country that first erupted in mass protest. And here, people point to the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, who was an unemployed 26-year-old fruit and vegetable vendor. Now, the story behind what happened between Bouazizi and the female sort of policewoman who confronted him when he was illegally selling his fruits and vegetables in his rural town, we don't know the details exactly of what happened. But it was believed that she may have physically assaulted him, slapped, some people call it the slap heard around the world, that led then to a humiliation on the part of Bouazizi that forced him, in his mind, to need to commit suicide. Now, Bouazizi's suicide was not the first, nor was he the first person to self-immolate in the Arab world. But there was something about this particular incident, where it occurred, the ties between his tribe and family and others in the city where he lived, the rural city in Tunisia, that then led to this protest movement that spread not only to other parts of Tunisia, but to other places across the region. So this is a picture of Bouazizi being visited by President Ben Ali after he had self-immolated but had not passed away yet. So you can see the Tunisian president wearing his suit and tie, looking very concerned about the fate of this young man. Tunisian street protests emerged after that. I thought this picture was quite telling in that the man engaging in the sort of confrontation with the police is holding a loaf of Tunisian bread, the French bread loaf. So this was really, in many ways, a protest about basic issues of economic dignity, in addition to political freedom.